July 27, 1953. The Yellow Sea lay gray and endless, the water beaten flat by wind, in a war that had finally ended. On the deck of a UN transport ship, a cluster of Korean women stood huddled in their thin clothes, their eyes wide, their bodies swaying with the rhythm of the sea. Some were nurses captured during the retreat from Seoul, others clerks or civilians who had been swept into the chaos of surrender. Their faces were pale, framed by dark hair knotted carelessly, and their expressions carried the exhaustion of a nation broken. They had grown up on posters that painted Americans as cruel beasts, demons with claws and fangs. Yet now they found themselves guarded by young men in pressed olive drab, men who spoke in unfamiliar accents, men who neither spat at them nor struck them, but instead offered cigarettes or water as if to strangers, not enemies. The women could hardly reconcile the scene before them with the warnings drilled into them through years of propaganda. The ship creaked as it cut toward the American coast, carrying the weight of surrender across the ocean. The women were silent at first, their bodies close, their breaths visible in the cool morning air. Some clutched the remnants of possessions, worn satchels, faded photographs, a folded hanbok hidden under military-issued blankets. Each woman carried with her not just belongings, but a story of how she had survived capture. One, a nurse of 28, had been stationed in a field hospital near Incheon, where she watched friends leap from buildings rather than fall into American hands. Another, barely 21, had been working as a typist in a garrison office when UN troops surrounded the city. A third, older than the rest, had been caring for children in a missionary compound when surrender swept them all into captivity. Their journeys were different, but they shared the same dread. What awaited them in the enemy land? The Americans on board were boys, many no older than the women themselves. Farm boys from Kansas, steel workers from Pittsburgh, baseball players from California, now transformed into sailors and guards. They walked the deck with casual authority, rifles slung loosely, smiles flickering when they caught the prisoners staring at them. One soldier, amused, held out a Lucky Strike cigarette, tapping the pack with 2 fingers before extending it like a peace offering. The women recoiled at first, unsure if it was a trick. When one finally accepted, her hands trembling, the soldier only nodded and lit it for her. It was a simple gesture, but it cracked something in the wall of fear built up over years of indoctrination. These are not monsters. They were unsettlingly just men. The sea voyage was long, and time aboard the transport blurred. Meals arrived at regular intervals, trays of bread, soup, sometimes even meat. The women were stunned by the abundance. Though some could not swallow it, their stomachs knotted by nerves. They whispered among themselves in Korean, voices barely audible above the engine noise. One said the tall soldiers looked like movie stars from Hollywood Films banned in their homeland. Another said she thought their smiles were frightening, too open, too free. A third admitted that the tall soldiers made her feel invisible like a child. They laughed nervously, but beneath the laughter lay unease. If everything they had been told was false, what else was a lie? If the enemy was not grotesque, but handsome, not vicious but courteous, then what had all the suffering been for? Their minds wrestled with questions they could not yet answer. The days passed, marked by bells and meals, the endless hiss of the ocean. Slowly the women adjusted, though fear never left entirely. They noticed details now. The way the Americans teased each other, the way one whistled a tune while polishing his boots, the way another prayed quietly at night, head bowed. Such ordinary acts seemed extraordinary. The women had been prepared for cruelty, yet instead they saw rituals of normal life. It was disarming, confusing, and strangely painful, for it reminded them of what their own brothers and husbands might have been if war had not consumed everything. The nurse who had survived Incheon found herself watching one particular soldier, a boy from somewhere called Ohio who could not have been older than her youngest brother. He carried photographs of his family, a farm somewhere in the American Midwest, and spoke gently to the other prisoners when distributing food. His kindness felt like a betrayal of everything she had believed about the enemy. How could someone so young, so ordinary, represent the forces that had torn her country apart? The contradiction gnawed at her as the ship rolled through another gray dawn. One afternoon, a soldier carried a phonograph into the common area. He cranked it, and music poured out, jazz rhythms, brassy and alive. The women froze, startled by the strange, infectious sound. Some smiled despite themselves. A few guards clapped in time, joking with one another. The nurse closed her eyes, listening, and felt tears burn at the corners. Music of all things reminded her that joy still existed, even in captivity. It was almost cruel in its beauty, yet it etched itself into memory as a moment when the walls of enmity cracked wide enough to let something human slip through. The women began to talk more freely among themselves, sharing observations that would have been treasonous back home. They compared notes on the soldiers' appearances, their mannerisms, their unexpected gentleness. The typist from Seoul admitted that she had expected to be assaulted within hours of capture, yet no one had touched her inappropriately. The missionary worker mentioned that the guards said please and thank you, words that seemed impossible from the mouths of supposed demons. Each small revelation chipped away at the foundation of their hatred. They were crossing an ocean, yes, but also crossing a chasm of understanding that propaganda had built between peoples. The ship groaned forward through the waves, carrying them toward an unknown shore, but also toward a reckoning with truth they were not sure they wanted to face. At night, lying in their bunks, the women stared at the ceiling and wondered what would become of them. Would they ever see Korea again? Would their families believe what they had witnessed aboard this ship? Would they themselves remember these moments of unexpected humanity, or would time and distance blur them into something more comfortable, more familiar? On the morning of July 30th, the shoreline finally appeared. A faint line, then a shape, then the unmistakable outline of America. The women pressed to the rails, their hearts quickening. For some, fear surged again. What trials awaited in this vast enemy land? For others, curiosity flared. The tall guards stood near them, gazing toward home, their postures easy, as if they were returning from a long shift rather than ending a world war. The contrast was almost unbearable. The prisoners were crossing into a land they had been taught to hate, a land that would now decide their fates. Yet standing beside them were men whose very presence contradicted every warning and caricature they had believed. The ship groaned as it neared the harbor, gulls circling above, the air sharper with the scent of land. One of the women, clutching her satchel, whispered to the nurse beside her, "If they're not monsters, then what are they?" It was a question heavy with both dread and wonder. The nurse had no answer. She only stared at the American docks rising from the horizon, where more soldiers waited, taller, broader, cleaner than she had imagined. Her pulse quickened. The journey across the ocean was ending, but the greater journey was only beginning. For what awaited them on American soil was not brutality, but something far stranger and perhaps even more unsettling. The harbor rose from a mist like a promise and a threat. Wooden piers stretched into the water. Cranes swung lazily overhead, and the smell of oil, salt, and coal drifted toward the transport ship as it eased closer to land. For the Korean women on deck, every detail carved itself into memory. They clutched their satchels and stared through the fog at the figures gathering along the docks. Rows of American soldiers stood waiting, their uniforms pressed, rifles resting casually, their posture steady but not cruel. The women drew in sharp breath. Even from this distance, the truth was undeniable. These men looked nothing like the propaganda posters. They looked like film actors, broad-shouldered and clean-shaven, their faces open and curious rather than cruel. Some wore caps pushed back on their heads, others had sleeves rolled up in the summer heat. They chatted among themselves, occasionally pointing at the approaching vessel, but their manner was casual, almost bored. There was no menace in their stance, no hunger for violence in their expressions. They might have been dock workers waiting for a cargo ship, not soldiers receiving enemy prisoners. The gangplank lowered with a metallic clang that echoed across the water. The women hesitated at the top, looking down at the wooden planks that would carry them onto American soil. Behind them, the ship that had been their world for weeks. Ahead, a country they had been taught to fear above all others. The nurse from Incheon stepped forward first, her legs unsteady after so long at sea. An American sergeant approached, his rifle slung across his back, a clipboard in his hands. He spoke in broken Korean, clearly having memorized a few phrases. "Welcome to America. You will be safe here. No harm will come to you." His pronunciation was terrible, but his tone was gentle, almost apologetic. The women exchanged glances. This was not the reception they had imagined. No shots, no shoving, no immediate violence. Instead, soldiers directed them toward waiting trucks with the same patience they might show visitors at a train station. The processing was efficient but surprisingly humane. Names were recorded, belongings inventoried, basic medical checks conducted. The American medics were thorough but respectful, asking permission before examining the women, providing privacy screens when needed. Each small courtesy felt like another crack in the wall of their preconceptions. They had prepared themselves for degradation and found instead a bureaucratic politeness that was almost more disturbing than cruelty would have been. At least cruelty would have confirmed what they believed. This unexpected kindness left them adrift, questioning everything they thought they knew about their captors and themselves. The internment facility was surrounded by high fences topped with wire, but the barracks inside were clean and well-maintained. Each woman was assigned a cot with fresh linens, a small locker for personal items, and access to communal washrooms that featured hot running water. The luxury of a hot shower after weeks of seawater baths felt almost sinful. The Korean women stood under the steaming spray, tears mixing with water, overwhelmed by this simple pleasure they had not expected to experience again. The daily routine began immediately. Breakfast at 7, served in a mess hall where American cooks ladled out portions of scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee. The food was abundant and rich, almost too much after months of meager rations. Some women could barely finish their plates, their stomachs unaccustomed to such plenty. Others ate mechanically, still waiting for the trap to spring, for the kindness to reveal itself as cruel manipulation. The guards who walked the perimeter were young men from small American towns, farm boys and factory workers who treated their duty with professional boredom rather than malicious enthusiasm. They nodded politely when passing the women during exercise periods, offered cigarettes through the fence, and seemed more interested in letters from home than in tormenting their charges. One guard from Minnesota showed photographs of his dairy farm, pointing proudly at prize Holstein cows. Another from Georgia shared stories about his sweetheart back home, a schoolteacher he planned to marry after his discharge. These glimpses into ordinary American lives felt more subversive than any propaganda. The women began to understand that their captors were not career soldiers drunk on conquest, but reluctant warriors eager to return to peaceful pursuits. The realization was both comforting and deeply unsettling. If these men were not monsters, then perhaps the entire war had been built on mutual misunderstanding rather than fundamental evil. The implications were too large to fully grasp. The women settled into rhythms that felt almost normal. Morning exercises in the yard, where they walked circuits while breathing fresh air that tasted of freedom despite the fences. Afternoon activities included basic English lessons taught by a patient corporal from Wisconsin who used picture cards and simple phrases. "Thank you. Please. How are you?" The Korean women repeated these words carefully, their tongues struggling with unfamiliar sounds, while their minds struggled with the kindness behind the instruction. No one forced them to learn. The lessons were optional, presented as a way to make their stay more comfortable rather than as preparation for interrogation. Some women attended eagerly, hungry for communication beyond gestures and broken phrases. Others remained suspicious, wondering if language lessons were another form of indoctrination. But even the skeptical ones found themselves listening from doorways, absorbing words despite their resistance. The camp provided small luxuries that felt revolutionary. a lending library stocked with books in Korean, donated by churches and cultural organizations from American Korean communities. Craft supplies for those who wanted to occupy their hands with sewing or drawing. Paper and pencils for writing letters, though the women had no way to send them and nowhere safe to send them to. These gestures of normalcy were more confusing than overt cruelty would have been. The women had prepared themselves to endure suffering with dignity. They had not prepared to navigate the moral complexity of enemy kindness. In the evenings, they gathered in small groups to process the day's experiences. Conversations that would have been unthinkable back home now happened in whispered Korean. One woman admitted that the American food reminded her of feast days from her childhood. Another confessed that she looked forward to the English lessons because the teacher reminded her of her deceased brother. A third spoke of dreams where she was not a prisoner but a guest, welcomed rather than captured. These admissions carried the weight of betrayal, yet also the relief of honest feeling. The nurse from Incheon found herself watching the guards during their shift changes, studying their faces and mannerisms with the intensity she had once reserved for medical diagnoses. She noticed how they complained about the heat, joked about girlfriends, and shared photographs from home with the same casual intimacy her own colleagues had shown in hospital break rooms. These men possessed no special cruelty, no innate violence that marked them as different from Korean men she had known. They were simply young, far from home, doing a job they had not chosen in a war they had not started. The realization was profoundly disturbing because it stripped away the comfortable distance that enemy status had provided. It was easier to hate monsters than to hate ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. The woman who had worked as a typist in Seoul began teaching herself to read American newspapers that guards sometimes left behind. Her English was limited, but she could parse headlines and simple sentences that painted pictures of American domestic life. Baseball scores, movie reviews, advertisements for household products she had never imagined. This glimpse into enemy normalcy felt like looking through a forbidden window into a world where people worried about entertainment and consumer goods rather than survival and ideology. The missionary worker who had cared for children discovered that several guards were deeply religious, attending Sunday services conducted by a military chaplain in a makeshift chapel near the main gate. She could hear hymns drifting across the compound, melodies that were foreign but unmistakably sacred. The music stirred something in her that transcended national boundaries, reminding her that faith had always been larger than the political systems that tried to contain it. These observations accumulated like water behind a dam, building pressure that demanded release. The women began to articulate thoughts that challenged everything they had believed about their enemies and, by extension, about themselves and their own nation's propaganda machine. By autumn, whispers of release began to spread. The Korean War was officially over, and repatriation negotiations had begun in earnest. For many women, the thought of returning to Korea was bittersweet. They longed for home, yet feared what home had become. News filtered in slowly through official channels and guard conversations. The peninsula remained divided. Cities lay in ruins. Families had been scattered or destroyed. To leave the camp meant to face a nation reshaped by conflict and ideological division. Strangely, for some, defenses no longer felt only like prison walls. They had become shelter from a harsher reality waiting beyond. The nurse who had survived the retreat from Seoul found herself dreading the moment she would have to explain her experiences to other Koreans. How could she describe the kindness of enemy soldiers without seeming like a collaborator? How could she speak of hot showers and abundant food without minimizing the suffering of those who had remained behind? The contradiction felt impossible to resolve. Her gratitude for decent treatment warred with loyalty to her homeland and guilt over her relative comfort during captivity. The typist from a government office faced different fears. She had seen enough American newspapers to understand that her country was now split between competing political systems, each claiming legitimacy and demanding absolute loyalty. Where would she fit in a divided Korea? Which side would accept someone who had spent months observing enemy humanity and finding it disturbingly familiar? The missionary worker worried about the children she had been caring for when capture separated them. Were they alive? Had other caregivers been found? Would she be allowed to return to her work? Or would her time in American custody mark her as politically unreliable? Each woman carried similar burdens of uncertainty, complicated by the unexpected gift of having discovered that enemies could be decent people caught in circumstances beyond their control. This knowledge felt both precious and dangerous, something that might need to be hidden to survive in a world that preferred its truths simple and its enemies clearly defined. When the day of departure drew near, the women gathered their belongings with mixed emotions. They folded their few personal items, tied bundles with string provided by sympathetic guards, and lined up once again for transport. The nurse looked back at the camp one final time. The barracks stood quietly, the fences still tall, the guards still watching. Yet in her memory, it was not the fences that remained sharp. It was the smell of bacon in the mornings, the hot showers, the polite gestures, the tall soldiers playing catch with a baseball in the afternoon sun. These details would travel with her long after the gates closed behind her. The corporal from Wisconsin who had taught English lessons approached the group with a cardboard box. Inside were small gifts from the guards, nothing valuable or inappropriate, just tokens of human connection. Pencils, notebooks, a few books in Korean, some photographs of American landscapes that had been shared during conversations. Each item represented a moment when the barrier between captor and prisoner had briefly dissolved into simple human interaction. The women accepted these gifts with ceremony that felt both grateful and guilty. As the trucks rumbled toward the port, the women whispered to each other in voices that would have been treasonous back home. Not of monsters, but of men. They looked like movie stars. One said quietly, this time without shame. Another added softly, they treated us better than we had any right to expect. The nurse remained mostly silent, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She felt a fundamental shift inside her, not toward love or admiration of America, but toward something more complex and troubling. The knowledge that truth had been more complicated than propaganda had ever acknowledged. War had been built on simplified narratives, but in captivity, she had glimpsed something that defied easy categorization. The reality that enemies could be decent people forced to play roles in conflicts they had not chosen was both liberating and terrifying as a concept to carry home. At the harbor, the ships waited, gray hulks ready to return them to the divided peninsula of Korea. The women climbed aboard, their satchels clutched, their hearts torn between longing and uncertainty. Behind them, America receded, a land of contradiction, of defeat transformed into unexpected mercy, of tall, handsome men who had shattered every story they had been told. The repatriation vessel was different from the transport that had brought them months earlier. This ship carried the weight of endings rather than beginnings, of questions rather than certainties. The Korean women stood at the rails watching the American coastline shrink into memory, knowing they were crossing more than an ocean. They were crossing back into a world where their experiences might need to be hidden, where the complexity of their captivity could be dangerous to acknowledge. The nurse from Incheon pressed her small notebook against her chest, pages filled with observations she had recorded in secret. Descriptions of American kindness that read like fiction, accounts of enemy humanity that contradicted everything her education had taught her. These writings felt both precious and perilous, evidence of truths that might be unwelcome in a homeland still processing the trauma of war and division. Other women carried their own forbidden treasures. The typist had kept an English dictionary given by a guard, hidden beneath her official belongings. The missionary worker clutched a small wooden cross carved by a soldier from Tennessee, a gift that represented shared faith transcending national boundaries. Each item was a fragment of experience that defied simple categorization, proof that war had not erased human decency, even between enemies. As the ship moved through international waters, the women began to understand that they were carrying something more dangerous than contraband. They were carrying the knowledge that propaganda from both sides had been built on deliberate distortions, that enemies were not inherently evil, that ordinary people could show extraordinary kindness even within the framework of conflict. This truth felt too large and too fragile to survive the political realities waiting for them in Korea. As the ship's engines roared to life, the nurse pressed her hands together and whispered a prayer, not for victory, not for revenge, but for understanding. She did not yet know what awaited in her divided homeland, but she knew one truth would remain with her forever. The enemy had looked into her eyes and treated her as human, and that memory, both painful and luminous, would not fade. The Korean peninsula appeared on the horizon as a thin line between sea and sky, growing larger as the repatriation vessel approached home waters. The women gathered at the rails one final time, watching their homeland emerge from the mist with feelings too complex for simple joy or simple sorrow. This was home, yet it was also the place where they would need to hide the most important truth they had learned. The harbor at Busan bustled with activity as officials prepared to process returning prisoners. Korean soldiers in crisp uniforms waited on the docks, their faces stern and professional, their postures radiating the authority of a nation rebuilding itself through strict ideological discipline. The contrast with the casual kindness of American guards felt stark and somehow ominous. The women understood instinctively that their experiences would need to be carefully edited for official consumption. As they disembarked, stepping onto Korean soil for the first time in months, each woman carried within herself a secret knowledge that felt both precious and dangerous. They had discovered that enemies could be decent human beings, that propaganda served political purposes rather than truth, that ordinary kindness could transcend the boundaries of war and nationality. These insights would remain with them through whatever trials awaited in a homeland divided between competing ideologies and suspicious of anyone whose loyalty might have been compromised by contact with the enemy. For touching the lives of tall, handsome American soldiers who had treated them with unexpected humanity, the women would carry forever the burden and gift of knowing that the world was more complicated and more hopeful than their governments had ever allowed them to believe.